Henry never imagined he'd be that guy. The one who walks in on his girlfriend tangled in another man's sheets. Her body arching, her lips forming a name that sure as hell wasn't his. But there she was, Lily. The woman he had spent 2 years loving, trusting, moving with a hunger she hadn't shown him in months. For a moment, time fractured, his breath caught, his pulse roared in his ears. The scene before him felt surreal, as if he had stepped outside his own body, forced to witness his own humiliation like a sick joke. Then she saw him. Her gasp was sharp, her limbs scrambling, sheets clutched to her chest as if modesty mattered now. Henry. He laughed, cold, hollow, not what it looks like. His own voice barely sounded like his. The man, Cowan, her coworker, the one she always said was just a friend, was already fumbling for his clothes, avoiding Henry's gaze like a coward. 3 months. That's how long it had been going on. 3 months of whispered lies. Stolen moments. Her body given to someone else while Henry had been blind. He turned on his heel. Heart hammering. He needed to get out. He needed air. He needed Luke. Henry barely remembered the drive to Luke's place. His mind was a storm, rage, betrayal, and something darker, something heavier pressing against his ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. He only knew that when he pulled into Luke's driveway. His hands were still clenched around the steering wheel. Knuckles white, breath ragged. He didn't even have to text. Luke was already stepping out onto the porch. His sharp eyes scanning Henry like he could see straight through him. Neither of them spoke at first. Luke just opened the passenger door, slid in, and exhaled. "Tell me where we're going." "Anywhere but here," Henry muttered, his throat tight. The club was electric, neon lights cutting through the haze of alcohol and sweat. The bass vibrating through his bones. It was exactly what he needed, loud, mind-numbing, a place where he could forget. The first shot burned, the second numbed, and by the third, he didn't care anymore. "Slow down," Luke murmured, eyes shadowed with concern. "I don't want to think." Then Henry was pulling him onto the dance floor, their bodies lost in the rhythm, the heat, the pulse of it all. When he turned, their faces were close, too close, Luke's breath warm against his lips, his hands steadying Henry's waist. And then, he kissed him. Desperate, reckless. For a second, just a second, Luke kissed him back. And just like that, Henry's world tilted on its axis in a way he never saw coming. Henry woke up to the soft weight of a blanket draped over him. The scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. His head pounded, a brutal reminder of the tequila-fueled spiral from the night before. Groaning, he forced his eyes open, blinking against the dim light filtering through the curtains. It took him a second to recognize where he was. Luke's apartment. And then, it hit him, the kiss. A sharp inhale cut through the silence. He sat up too quickly, his stomach twisting with the aftermath of alcohol and something far more unsettling. Across the room, Luke sat in an armchair, phone in hand, leg bouncing restlessly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't making a joke about Henry's hangover. He was just watching. "You're awake," Luke finally said, voice unreadable. Henry swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Yeah." A pause. "Do you remember?" The words landed between them like a lit fuse. Henry's mind flashed. Luke's lips on his. The way his body had pressed into him for that one electric second before everything shattered. He started, but the words caught. Luke exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You kissed me." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't nothing either. Henry's stomach twisted. His default response was on the tip of his tongue. "I was drunk." It didn't mean anything. But for some reason, he couldn't say it. Because that would have been the biggest lie of all. They didn't talk about the kiss after that. Not directly, anyway. Instead, it lingered between them, unspoken but heavy, like an invisible thread pulling too tight. Henry told himself it was nothing, a drunken mistake. A moment of grief, not some deep-seated desire waiting to claw its way out. And yet, things were different. The way he looked at Luke changed. Or maybe, He was just noticing now how Luke ran a hand through his hair when he was thinking, how his voice dipped when he was tired, how his fingers twitched slightly when he was holding something back. Late nights at Luke's apartment stretched longer, filled with quiet conversation, their usual banter laced with something more charged. Every time Henry moved, he was hyper-aware of Luke, his body, his presence, the way the air seemed to shift when they were too close. One night, Luke handed him a beer, their fingers brushing, and Henry swore the touch lingered. It sent something sharp through him, not fear, not confusion, just heat. "Henry," Luke said softly, watching him. Henry blinked, realizing he'd been staring too long. He forced a smirk, swallowing whatever the hell had just risen in his throat. "What?" Luke held his gaze for a beat longer, then shook his head, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Nothing." But it was something. And as Henry took a slow sip of his drink, feeling the weight of Luke's eyes still on him, he knew he was running out of ways to ignore it. The breaking point came on a night that felt like any other, until it wasn't. They were watching some mindless action movie, neither really paying attention. Henry was restless, his knee bouncing, his thoughts tangled. Luke sat beside him, quiet, unreadable, his beer half finished on the coffee table. The tension between them had been building for weeks, thick, suffocating, a spark waiting for ignition. And then it happened. Henry shifted, bumping into Luke. It was nothing, except Luke didn't move away. Instead, he turned, his gaze locking onto Henry's, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "What are we doing?" Luke murmured, voice low, almost hesitant. Henry's pulse pounded. "What do you mean?" Luke exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "You know exactly what I mean." A silence stretched between them, heavy, charged. Henry could hear his own breathing, feel the heat radiating off Luke's skin. The air felt too thick, too charged with something unspoken but undeniable. And then, fire. Henry grabbed Luke by the shirt, yanking him forward, their mouths crashing together in a kiss that was nothing like the first. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't fueled by alcohol. This was real. Luke didn't hesitate. His hands found Henry's waist, gripping tight, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until it was all heat, all need, all them. By the time they pulled apart, breathless, Henry knew there was no going back. And for the first time, he didn't want to. After that night, there was no more pretending. They didn't talk about it, not in words, at least, but the way they moved around each other changed. The stolen glances grew bolder. The lingering touches became deliberate. The distance they had once forced between them collapsed entirely. It started with small things. A brush of fingers when passing a drink. A knee pressed against the other under the table. Neither of them moving away. The way Henry caught Luke watching him when he thought he wasn't looking. And then it escalated. One night, Henry showed up at Luke's apartment late, heart pounding for a reason he refused to name. Luke answered the door, shirtless, damp from the shower, and Henry forgot how to breathe. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Henry stepped inside. Luke backed up. The door slammed shut behind them. And then Henry was pushing him against it. Their mouths colliding in a kiss that was all heat, all desperation, all finally. Clothes hit the floor, hands roamed, memorized, bodies pressed together, burning. The air between them was electric, charged with something they had spent too long denying. Luke's breath was ragged against Henry's skin as he murmured, "You sure about this?" Henry's grip tightened, his lips ghosting over Luke's jaw. "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, they didn't hold back. And in the aftermath, tangled in sheets and each other, Henry realized he never wanted to. It should have been simple, easy, just two bodies seeking comfort, losing themselves in heat, in the hunger that had been simmering between them for far too long. But it wasn't. Because every touch, every kiss, every whispered name in the dark meant something. And Henry could feel it, Luke pulling back. Not physically, but in the way his hands hesitated before settling on Henry's skin. In the way his breath hitched like he was bracing himself for something inevitable. Then, one night, it cracked. They lay in bed, bodies still tangled, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. Henry's fingertips traced lazy patterns over Luke's ribs. His heart still racing, but Luke was quiet, too quiet. "What's wrong?" Henry murmured. A slow exhale. Then, "This isn't going to be enough, is it?" Henry froze. His stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Luke shifted, rolling onto his back, staring at the ceiling. "I mean, what happens when this," he gestured between them, frustration tightening his voice, "stops being new? When reality kicks in, when you wake up one day and realize this was just a phase." Something cold slid down Henry's spine. It wasn't an accusation, it was fear. And for the first time, Henry realized, Luke wasn't afraid of what they were doing. He was afraid of losing Henry after. But Henry wasn't going anywhere. And he needed Luke to know that. Luke was leaving. Henry didn't realize how much that sentence could wreck him until he saw the packed duffel bag by the door. The way Luke's hands clenched into fists at his sides, like he was forcing himself to go through with it. "You're running," Henry said, voice low, steady. Luke huffed out a bitter laugh. "I'm protecting myself." His jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with something that looked too much like pain. "Because you don't know what you want, Henry. And he swallowed hard, shaking his head. "I can't be the guy you figure it out with, only to watch you walk away when it stops making sense." Henry's pulse was a roar in his ears. "You think I don't know what I want?" He stepped forward, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off Luke's skin. "You think I'm just playing with this? With you?" Luke's silence was worse than a fight. Henry's chest ached, his hands fisted at his sides, then loosened. "I don't care what this means," he murmured, voice raw. "I don't care what label it has, or what people expect, or what makes sense. All I know," he exhaled sharply, shaking his head, "all I know is I can't let you walk out that door." Luke's breath hitched. And then Henry was kissing him, hard, desperate, like it was a promise. Luke didn't pull away. Because this time, he believed him.